G'day, I'm Derek Fildebrandt, publisher of the Western Standard. Today we're talking migration, mass migration. We've got a really special guest in today, Tony Keller. He is a columnist with the Globe and Mail. Don't hold it against him. He does some really fantastic writing on the topic and has recently published a book that I've read a good deal of excerpts from, not the whole thing yet, but I'm absolutely going to be ordering a copy to get through the whole thing. He's the author of Borderline Chaos: How Canada Got Immigration Right and Then Wrong. Tony, thank you very much for joining us here today.
Derek, it's good to be here with you.
So we'll dive straight into it. As I said, I didn't read I have not read the book yet, but I'm going to order it actually as soon as I'm done in here. I got to read the whole thing. We were talking just before we started rolling that, 2 years ago, immigration only started to come onto my radar. I've cared about it in the context of Europe and to a lesser extent the United States for a long time, seeing some negative things happening in Europe that I have an affinity for and care about, but wasn't affecting me. It wasn't in my face daily life. But it wasn't it only started to come on my radar in the last 2 years as a major issue. 4 years ago, I probably wouldn't have rated it in my top 20 as an issue I would care about as a Canadian or Albertan voter. But today it's number one. It's kind of a litmus test issue of candidates I will vote for. I'm only slightly exaggerating to say it's a litmus test about who I would vote for school board trustee. What are you going to do about immigration? Unlike Europe and the United States, though, Canada, for at least in our modern history, as long as I've been alive, essentially, immigration has not been a major issue of polarized political debate in Canada. But that has obviously changed. Why do you think that's changed?
So to go back to the subtitle of my book, How Canada Got Immigration Right and Then Wrong, you got to talk about the right before you talk about the wrong. And what Canada got right, and it's quite remarkable, is we had this kind of left-right consensus. Conservatives, New Democrats, Liberals, all basically were happy with the same immigration policy. Canada actually had a fairly high rate of immigration, but we also had a fairly high level of border control, meaning that people who immigrated to Canada were largely chosen by Canada. Canada had a real focus on economic immigrants and on trying to attract and choose immigrants who had high levels of skills, high levels of education, meaning they would benefit Canada when they came here. And you put it all together. And so Canada had this kind of magic situation where we actually had much higher levels of immigration than the United States or most European countries. Yet we had no political controversy because Canadians, I believe, largely felt that immigration was a choice. It was a national choice. The level we were getting, the number of people we were getting, the type of people we were getting was all a national choice. And Canadians felt like, hey, this is all under control. And in fact, because Canada controls its borders and controls its immigration, we're going to actually have even more immigration than the United States and Europe. And I think the sense of confidence that Canadians had in the system collapsed in sort of 2021, 2022, 2023. And that's, my book is about that, the happy past, but it's mostly about the things that then went wrong over the last few years that really did damage the immigration system. And Canadians lost confidence with good reason, because the system had been changed in ways that were not good for Canada, and that caused Canadians to lose confidence.
So let's talk about that. I think I can't find anything to disagree with what you're saying. Pretty hardcore conservatives were maybe a little more skeptical of migration. They'd say, well, let's maybe be a bit more picky and choosy about, I like this country more than that country. People from that part of the world maybe integrate a little bit better than that. But in the broad strokes, pretty much everyone was agreed that, we're choosing economic migrants. We had family reunification, stuff like that were maybe a little more controversial, but they never made it onto the mainstream political debate. The debates were always on the margins on this, and that's changed. So but broadly speaking, most people think, like yourself, we got migration right for a pretty extended period of time. And then we changed things pretty radically. And this began under the Trudeau government, I think in kind of halfway through it, roughly. What was it they so radically changed, and why did they make such radical changes?
Yeah. So a few different things happened. And the Trudeau government came into office kind of wanting to argue, I think, that the Conservative Party under Stephen Harper had somehow been insufficiently generous and insufficiently open to immigration. And I think there may have been a fair number of voters who actually believed that. The truth, of course, was that under the Harper government, Canada had basically the same immigration levels that it had had under the Paul Martin government and under the Chrétien government, and going all the way back to Mulroney. So Canada
I don't mean to interrupt, but are you referring to, I remember that 2015 election that was right around the time as the Syrian migration crisis. Germany obviously made some decisions that had big implications for itself and for the rest of Europe. And I remember that became a big topic, and it kind of got into a bidding war between the Liberals, the NDP, and the Conservatives at that time about who was going to take the most refugees. Is that what you're talking about in terms of perception, that the Conservatives were seen as not open enough to migration?
I think that was a part of the piece. But there are words in the Liberal platform, and they aren't really backed by any substance, just saying, we're going to be more open. Stephen Harper has run an immigration policy that's not fully Canadian and generous, and we're going to do more. They were never particularly specific about this. Syrian refugees was part of the piece. And by the way, the Syrian refugee arrival worked really well. And to me, the Syrian refugee arrival was actually an example of how the Canadian immigration system works well. Every single one of those people who was brought here as a Syrian refugee came from overseas, was vetted before they came. The numbers were not excessive. And the truth was, what the Trudeau government did wasn't that much more than what the Harper government would have done. It was somewhat more, but not that much more. But that was actually a fairly small piece of it. So there was this rhetorical push from the Trudeau government to say more immigration would be better, just vaguely, without specifics. And as they went on, they started to get into it a bit more. But it really, really exploded during the pandemic. So prior to the pandemic, there had already been this run-up in the number of temporary foreign workers and foreign students. And what people don't understand is that Canada basically went from having one immigration system, which is permanent migration. You become a permanent resident and you become a citizen. Canada, that was always the core of the Canadian immigration system. We kind of developed a second system, which is people who come here as temporary foreign workers or as students, and a large percentage of those students are temporary foreign workers in disguise, because they're going to not particularly high quality programs and they're working full time while they're in school. The government's finally scaled that back, but they had scaled it up previously. So you kind of had these two parallel systems, and the temporary system by 2022 had become bigger than the permanent system. And by 2023, it was much bigger than the permanent system. And that's how you went from having a fairly small number of temporary residents in Canada, let's say in the year 2000, to today we have 3 million people in Canada who are temporary residents, all of whom came because they want to become permanent residents. But the temporary resident number is so much bigger than the number of permanent resident places available each year. So there was, like, some of this stuff is just an incredibly basic failure to count, to figure out that if you're going to let a lot of people through a side door who hope to get in through the front door, you kind of have to count. You kind of have to say, hang on a second, there have to be some limits. So the government, under the Trudeau government, permanent immigration was doubled, but temporary immigration went up far, far more than that. It was quadrupled or quintupled. That's that. And the second part, the temporary immigration part, there were no caps. There were no caps on the number of foreign students who could come to Canada, and there were no caps on the number of temporary foreign workers that businesses could hire. And that is sort of the problem, that we went from a system that had a sense of control and limits and targeting high-end immigrants who got educations and skills, to an immigration system that became very tilted towards bringing in people who could work low-end jobs in warehouses, in fast food, delivering Uber Eats, things like that. We actually torqued our system towards filling low-end jobs, and the government became convinced that Canada had a massive labor shortage, and a labor shortage at the bottom of the labor market, which I don't think is at all the case, but the government momentarily became convinced of that by business. So it was a strange marriage of progressive ideas and business lobbying.
So I want to go further on that. I think you called it, it was kind of the, paraphrasing you, but it was kind of the liberals, I think, view corporate and business as conservative. I don't think that's necessarily true, but it was, kind of corporate elites wanted this, but at the same time, it fit with kind of a progressivist ideological need to be more multicultural, more multiracial, more multilingual, etc. And so they saw no conflict. But I think the obvious conflict, I don't know why they'd ever said anything, should have been labor. Like labor organizations appeared, maybe I just missed it, but I watched these guys relatively closely, and I didn't see a peep from labor organizations. And it cut the lower rungs kind of out of the labor market, replacing them with I think of, if I go to Tim Hortons or McDonald's, used to be mostly Canadian born kids with their first job, getting a little experience. But if I have to pay them a $15 minimum wage for someone to fill that job, I'd probably rather hire a foreign adult who's more likely to show up for work on time than an unreliable Canadian kid. And that's why that's at least why I think we're just not seeing as many Canadians working these low end jobs or Uber Eats. It's not entirely, but mostly, I think, new migrant labor, and kind of cut the bottom out of the labor market, especially when you have fairly high minimum wages. Why was there no pushback from people or organizations that are kind of supposed to represent that part of the labor market? I get why big business wants to suppress wages at the bottom end, because then you end up suppressing them kind of everywhere else when you suppress them at the bottom end, to an extent at least. I might save 25 cents on my Uber Eats, and so I guess there's I'm not competing for that labor market. So there's a benefit for me as someone who's not at the bottom end. So I benefit maybe a little bit by that. But people at the lower end don't seem to get any benefit by this. Why was there no pushback for those people in the Canadian labor market who were displaced?
That to me has always been sort of the fascinating thing, that this was a policy where there was kind of an all stakeholder agreement. You have groups like the Century Initiative. So that would be sort of, as you put it, big business elites saying, hey, Canada does need higher immigration. We need more numbers. And they had some details on better immigration, but they really focused on more. You have all kinds of small businesses, not just big business. All your local businesses are saying, we want to be able to hire temporary foreign workers one way or another, because the guy down the street has been able to do it, so we want to do it. So it's not just sort of some people off on a tower in Bay Street on the 45th floor. It's people right down on Main Street who are saying, look, I want this opportunity because the business down the street is getting the opportunity. You've got colleges and universities lobbying for it, saying if we can bring in more and more and more foreign students, we can make some money. And some of them were super responsible about that. And a lot of institutions, lower end institutions, were not at all responsible. You have a number of provincial governments who are lobbying the federal government and saying, we want more immigration and we need more temporary migration. There's a labor shortage. And some governments, Ontario in particular, saying we want more more foreign students, lots more foreign students, because we think that's going to help finance our higher education sector. And again, the students tended to go in Ontario to the lowest end institutions, not the highest end institutions. You've got progressive groups saying immigration is good inherently. Like, it's a value. It's not a practical matter. It's a value. And if you're saying more immigration, that's good. And if you're saying same or less, that's bad. The liberals themselves rhetorically kind of adopted that. So there's sort of nobody against it. And to me, the surprise is that there was not really any pushback from labor. But there really wasn't. And yeah, that is kind of a surprise. I will say that you made one point that I think is quite important, which is for someone who's upper middle class, like, everything in the economy has costs and benefits. So for someone who's upper middle class, or middle class to upper middle class, certain things become cheaper if you have a lot more people arriving to do low end jobs. If you're doing a bit of wage suppression at the bottom end of the market, your burrito is going to be a little cheaper, and the delivery of your burrito is going to be a little cheaper, and your ability to order something from Amazon and have it delivered is going to be a little cheaper. So it is about choices. Like, there are benefits to that. But what you have to remember is that every person in the Canadian economy is, they're a taxpayer, but they're a user of taxpayer services. They're providing labor, but they also need benefits. So if you have a whole lot of people at the bottom end of the labor market earning very low wages, all those people still have to send their kids to school, and they still have to use social services. They still have to use healthcare services. So if you're bringing in a lot of people whose wages and hence whose taxes are going to be much lower, someone else is going to have to help subsidize those services. So everything's got costs and benefits, and there was just not really a great deal of thought about the costs, and there was an enormous focus on look at the benefits and pretending as if there was nothing on the other side of the ledger.
So yeah, I know they've tampered things back a bit, but I'm not convinced. We'll get into how we fix this, further in the interview. But I saw there was an ad or a social media post running as an ad from Citizenship and Immigration Canada. I saw it just the other week, where, and I forget the exact wording of it, but I think I'd be fair when they said, like, Canada has free healthcare. Have you considered coming to Canada? To which I thought, that is the most insane advertisement ever. Like, we're saying, come to my store so I can give you something for free. That's a one-way transaction. That's why we should, at least in theory, limit family unification migration, because grandma and grandpa coming from overseas, they're not spending their life as taxpayers contributing to the social contract of things, and therefore then able to receive the benefits later in life. No, he's just saying, come here, and whatever illness you have, we're going to take care of it, etc. Advertising the burden on the Canadian taxpayer for it, not the benefit. And that was very recently, after things are supposed to have been tamped down. So you could address that if you like. Yeah, let's talk quickly about that before I go on to what I want.
Yeah, so I don't want to put too much weight on that ad, because again, keep in mind, the government of Canada puts out 5,000 web pages a day. This was one that sort of got blown up and highlighted. I forget even which ministry it was in, just wanted to say, hey, look, here are the advantages of coming to Canada.
And it was Citizenship and Immigration.
Was it? Okay. So for what it's worth.
They should know.
Yeah. But for what it's worth, that is actually one of the benefits of coming to Canada. So we should try to sell the benefits of Canada, but we should also be thoughtful about sort of choosing who gets those benefits. And listen, what I want to say is, look, my book is a pro-immigration book, but it's also a pro-limits and thoughtful, sensible behavior around immigration book. So I think people of every race, every nationality, every ethnicity, every religion should be able to come to Canada, should be able to apply to come to Canada. But let's just be thoughtful about who we choose to allow to come to Canada, which is how the system was working for a generation, and how it sort of stopped working over the last few years. That to me is the key. We should try to sell Canada really hard and get the best immigrants possible. And in the past, we had family reunification, but that was around sort of 20% of the system, and it still is. We had refugees, that's sort of 15% of the system, and it still is. And we had economic migrants, sort of 60 something percent of the system. But the percentages didn't change that much. What really changed was we became much less choosy on the economic immigration side, and we dropped standards enormously. So to kind of anticipate a follow-up question here, that's where we got to go, is be smart on who we're choosing on the economic immigration side.
So I've read, I think, in excerpts, and I've watched or listened to some of the interviews you've already done. And so in it, you've said, the Liberals did not change the immigration policy as necessarily a particularly ideological agenda. It was not meant to replace the Canadian-born population. And I very much agree that, there was big business pushing for things. There was this kind of all stakeholder, at least the stakeholders they'd listened to, all stakeholder consensus. And also, I think a lot of people like myself were just not paying attention to it because it just hadn't been a major issue here before. But historically, in the broad strokes, migrants have tended to vote liberal or progressive. There's been, the anomaly to that was 2011 federally, where the Conservatives had a major breakthrough with New Canadians. But even then, I think essentially mitigated the Liberal advantage on it, perhaps. But, they didn't necessarily become a strong Conservative cohort. But that was a one-off, historically speaking, and not just in Canada, but in the Western democracies broadly. Migrants have tended, more often than not, to vote for more progressivist parties that are seen as more open to multiculturalism, etc. That happens in Europe, happens in the States, and at least the more, it's an abused term, but the kind of the woke progressivist wing of the Liberal Party saw whiteness or Westernness as inherently evil and guilt-ridden. Is there really no partisan? Was there no partisan or ideological aspect of this beyond just kind of the stakeholder consensus to do this because it would be a good in and of itself to change the demographic makeup of Canada?
So I'll say two things on that. One is I have no reason to believe that there was any sort of conscious calculation within the Liberal Party or anybody else to say, aha, we're going to change the demographic makeup of Canada. I again, other people can try to look into this. I have no reason to believe that's what was going on. What I will say is that the Liberal Party did believe, and a lot of progressive people believe, that immigration is a value. And as a result, they don't think about immigration in the way I'm thinking of it. I'm thinking of it as a calculus. I'm saying, okay, look, we're going to have immigration. We should have immigration. There are all kinds of positive things about immigration. Let's try to maximize the positives and let's try to minimize the negatives, because every policy choice has positives and negatives. So let's just try to do immigration well rather than doing immigration badly, rather than simply saying however much immigration we have, we should have more. And once we get to that higher level, we should have even more because it's of value. What I'm saying is, let's try to do this as a rational policy analysis of benefit to Canada and benefit to Canadians, as opposed to just we must have higher immigration because it's good. So I think that's how I'm coming at this. One other thing I want to say is on the issue of how immigrants vote, it's complicated. People's votes, change over time. And one of the things that I've found very interesting, you brought up the 2011 election, where the Harper government did very well with non-white and immigrant voters and really was shifting the needle. And you also saw it in the most recent federal election, where in Brampton and some other areas of the GTA, analysis suggests that a whole lot of immigrant and non-white voters shifted to the Conservative Party. They were upset about various issues such as crime, and they shifted to the Conservative Party. So I think one of the great things about Canada is that the Conservative Party, the Liberal Party, the NDP, they all want to attract immigrant and non-white voters. No one's running against immigrants. No one's, or historically, no one has for generations. And that's great. All the parties have essentially said, if you're a Canadian voter, we would like you to vote for us. We're not targeting you, except we're trying to reach you with our message. To me, that's a pretty good thing, because we all have to live together. And so I don't subscribe to any theory of controlling immigration or limiting immigration for sort of racial, ethnic, or cultural reasons. Canada is already a multicultural, multiracial, multi-ethnic society. The numbers, Canada has changed a lot in the last generation, and we can't turn back the clock on that. We have to figure out how people of different races and ethnicities and faiths and beliefs can all live together and all love Canada. And even if as we have disagreements about which political party we vote for and which party we want to have in government, but hopefully those disagreements aren't going to break down on racial lines. They're going to break down on ideological lines, which is fun.
So I want to go down this path a bit more. I guess this is the spicy part of the topic. So, you've talked about the economic and labor market impacts. I think where the sector really started to break into the mainstream conversation was around housing. All of a sudden, housing it's a multi-layered issue. It'd be very unfair to place it squarely on the feet of migration, but migration is a major component of it. But that's where it started to become mainstreamed, is like, well, I'm not racist for talking about the fact that, I'm 30 years old and I have no chance of ever owning a home. That does make me racist. What's behind this? Oh, okay, migration started to enter the mainstream conversation from there. Social services, we talked about that. How are people going to pay into the system when you've kind of flooded the bottom end of the labor market? But one of the big things that I think has become a more mainstream conversation lately, despite, I think, the reticence of many to talk about it, is the cultural impact. That it's not just that people look differently in your communities, it's that they're acting differently, that we've taken in so many so fast that there hasn't been an ability to assimilate them. And I know we don't like to use the word assimilation in Canada, but at the end of the day, a successful migration policy has to involve assimilation to our basic values, our cultural norms. You might, we're all fine, keep eating, but the food from where you're from, that's all fine and good. We like all that. But some broad cultural norms that you have to be assimilated into, language, etc. We haven't been able to do that. And I think that is where the migration conversation is also going. It's beyond the economic, it's beyond the physical, it's beyond the labor market and housing. It's in the, what do you think has been the cultural impact of this policy? And what do you think has been the backlash, or where do you think that backlash is going?
So this is sort of where I'm on one side of this line and you're on the other side of this line. Like I want to keep the conversation on economic issues. I want to keep the conversation on how do we benefit Canada in ways that will, benefit the labor market, benefit Canadians, benefit our social services. That's where I want to focus. I don't know how to run an immigration system based on kind of, ways of preserving Canada's culture the way it is, or ways of not changing Canadian culture. One, I don't know how to do that. Two, I don't want to do that. And I don't really think it's possible. Look, my ancestors came to Canada. So on my mother's side, from the Russian Empire, they practiced a weird religion. They didn't speak English. And
so were they Mennonites or something, or
they were Jewish. And here I am talking to you in English, and you just think I'm a white guy Canadian. But if I show you pictures of them, you would think they were weird, exotic people. And I can guarantee you, the people who encountered them when they arrived in 1894 thought they were weird, exotic people. On my father's side of the family, they came here from Germany, also Jewish, also wouldn't have spoken English. So, and yet somehow, Canada actually has historically done an extremely good job of Canadians don't like to use the word assimilation. But the truth is people come here and they become Canadians and they come to love Canada and it all works. I can't guarantee you that every single person in every single place, but it is going to, it's going to work out, but it is generally worked out. And I don't know how to do things differently. And I honestly don't want to run the immigration system on kind of cultural metrics. I think the logical way to do it is to say, let's run it on economic metrics. And again, and sort of to flesh that out a bit, we built an immigration system over the last few years. The Trudeau government, with the help of the provinces and businesses, built a system that said, we really want 100,000 new fast food workers. It would have been nice if they had said, we want 10,000 more doctors.
Look, I'm with you on the economic side, but I think, yeah, we perhaps are on different sides of the line on the cultural side. We kind of woke up one day to find crowds of people in our streets, not all migrants, that'd be very unfair to say, but large components being migrants holding anti-Semitic demonstrations. And we're like, oh my God, where did all these anti-Semites come from? And, it's got the regular blue-haired college or university campus types. It's got them in there and, your regular crunchy professional protesters, but big components being migrants who come from a part of the world where disproportionately there's a bit of conflict. And we're all of a sudden, saying, oh my God, where did this all come from? And we're all kind of afraid to say it. I'm a little less so, but like that's a shocking thing to many people when we see this kind of thing in our streets. And it is not entirely, but in significant measure, an imported issue that we just wouldn't have seen on our streets until that recently. And that's cultural. I don't think necessarily, targeting this, recalibrating to economic issues would necessarily fix that problem. Maybe you disagree. Tell me where I'm wrong.
Yeah. So I disagree with you on two bases. One, as I said, I don't know how we can run an immigration system based on some kind of a cultural test. Two, honestly, having gone to some of those protests to see who's doing what and who's protesting and chanting from the river to the sea, boy, there are a lot of white people. There are a lot of white progressives who were born in Canada and went to university in Canada. So these are cultural shifts that I think would be happening regardless of the immigration system. And again, I don't know how we can talk about this given that Canada is already a multicultural, multiracial, multi-ethnic society. I just think it would tear society apart if we said there are certain religions, we don't want any more of those people in Canada. They're already in Canada. Canada already has millions of people of different races and different religions. And I don't know, like, there's no turning the clock back. We got to figure out how to make it work with the clock going forward. That is my argument.
All right, well, let's look forward about how we fix this. I think you and I will probably see eye to eye on a lot of it. The guy producing this show right now, he's I won't get into his details. He'll get bashful, but he's a relatively recent migrant. I'm not just blowing smoke up his arse here, but he's a hard worker. He's competent. Despite not being fairly recent, I think fairly assimilated. He's brought some of his interesting food into the office from time to time, and we like it. So even in this wave, some great folks have come through, but obviously far too many have come through, and far too many who are not of the previous caliber we used to expect have come through. Now, you've said that the government started to turn down the taps. They've not turned off the taps, nowhere close to turning off the taps. But even if we were to fully turn off the taps, I mean, there's a lot of damage done here on the economic side, the fiscal side, just the actuaries of how this is going to work out for government budgeting for social services going forward, the housing market. And then, well, you and I might disagree. I would say very much on the cultural side, that we've taken so many so fast that we cannot adequately assimilate people. Should we not send like a lot of these folks who are not citizens? If you're a citizen, that's sacrosanct, you're here. But should we not be sending a lot back? Like, do we need a moratorium on this to just catch our breath for some time, and then, a decade or whatever it is from now, we can say, okay, we've caught our breath, labor markets recovered, housing markets recovered, people have assimilated a bit, now we could start this up again. How do we fix this?
So, yeah, what the government said, what the late Trudeau government said, and what now the Carney government has said is, okay, first of all, permanent immigration, we've lowered the numbers a bit. Second of all, we're aiming for considerably lower numbers of new temporary migrants and foreign students. And the assumption is that a lot of the people who are here on temporary visas, temporary foreign workers and temporary foreign students, some of them will become permanent residents and citizens. We'll choose some of those, and everybody else is going to have to go home. And it's going to be challenging. Like, that is actually going to be the hardest part. And this is where we're going to see kind of the fallout in years to come. Is the last time I saw some numbers that suggested that about 1 million people would have their temporary permits expire, I believe, in 2025 and 2026. And that's way more than the number of people who can become permanent residents. We're going to pick fewer than 400,000 permanent residents. Some of them will be refugees. Some will be family reunification. A chunk of them will be economic immigrants chosen from overseas. You have less than 100,000 places left for temporary residents in Canada to become permanent residents. And you have like 1 million of them who are going to have their visas expire, and who in theory are supposed to just get on a plane and go home. And so we're probably going to have a much larger number of people who are in Canada, not legally, and continuing to work. So this is going to be a challenge that we are going to have to work. The government's going to have to work through, and it isn't going to disappear instantly. I think we can create a much better system. We can choose better. We can get the numbers to a more moderate level. And again, by the way, we'd still have higher immigration than most European countries, and we still have higher immigration than the United States, but we'd be doing a better job of controlling who we choose and choosing well, as we did pre-2015.
I want to kind of maybe come back to restate the crux of my last question, though, about is what you're saying that we should, refocus on economic migration and bring the numbers down, because you don't think then that like so much damage has been done here that we should not have like a moratorium for some period, with some exceptions, like the extremely high valued economic migrants. We got high level doctors, high level engineers. Okay, fine. We're not saying hermetically seal the border here, but in broad measure, we need to more. I've been of opinion that we need more or less, with some reasonable exceptions, a moratorium here. You disagree with that and think we more or less we can get away with reverting to where we were before this?
I wouldn't put a moratorium on immigration, but to put things in perspective. Okay, so in between 2022 and 2024, net immigration to Canada, so that's new permanent residents, but also all this temporary stream, Canada took in 3.1 million people in the space of 36 months. And again, just to make that number really clear, that includes deducting people who left. So temporary migrants who came minus temporary migrants who left, you get 3.1 million. It's an enormous number. So we have to get to a much lower number than that. And that's basically the government's plan. I don't have a problem with the plan so much. I have a problem with the way they're going to execute it, because they're basically saying we're going to have around 400,000 or a little bit less than 400,000 permanent immigrants a year. And for several years, the temporary immigration stream is actually going to be negative. There are going to be more temporary immigrants leaving Canada than arriving under the government's plan. And that has to be the case because the numbers were so large over the previous 3 years. So if you look at the numbers in that way, you'll say, wow, we're lowering immigration a lot to compensate for what happened from 2022 to 2024. But I think it would make no sense to put any kind of a moratorium on immigration. But effectively, look, on the temporary migration side, what the government has said is, what the Carney government has said is happening, is we're actually having negative immigration. That's actually their policy goal. I think they're going to have a lot of trouble achieving that, but that actually is their policy goal for a couple of years.
There was an old general, von Moltke, said, no battle plan survives contact with the enemy. And I can see this on paper being a good plan, but it's going to have contact with reality. Do we really believe, though, that all of these people who came in on a temporary basis and are then here illegally are going to go back? And now, of course, it would never be 100%. That's never going to happen. But in the broad strokes, because, in your writings, you said there was a wink, wink, nudge, nudge. It was a wink, wink agreement to these people that you're going to come here as a phony student and you're going to get to work at Uber, driving an Uber or something. But in the end, we're going to make you a permanent resident and a citizen at some point. And there's kind of a bait and switch here. And, so I'm not blaming the migrants. I'm blaming the system, as you do in your book here. It's not the fault of people who want to come to a richer, wealthier, more secure country. It's the fault of the people who brought them in on a misleading basis. Or actually, maybe that was actually the intention. It's just no longer the intention. But there's going to be a bunch of people, I think, who do not voluntarily self-deport here. And that, I think, then leaves us with, broadly speaking, two options. ICE-style raids where we're sending out law enforcement to round up illegal migrants, or an amnesty where we reward people for breaking the law. Where do you, I guess, how successful do you think it's likely to be in the absence of some kind of ICE-style enforcement against illegal migrants who have not voluntarily self-deported?
Yeah.
So how successful do you think that'll be? And then two, if it's not successful, do we go the route of then that kind of hard enforcement, or do we go the route of an amnesty that would reward people for breaking the law?
So I want to go back and talk a little bit about history to try to explain this and to do a contrast between Canada and the United States. So for the last 30, even 40 years, illegal immigration has been a huge issue in the United States. There's an enormous amount of noise around it. And there's an enormous amount of performative enforcement where Republican governments make a big noise, and Trump is the latest, of look at how much we're doing to address this. And Canada, on the other hand, has traditionally had very little illegal immigration. And it's because of a whole bunch of subtle bureaucratic measures that used to work and could still work if we use them. So, you can't just get on a plane and come to Canada. It's really hard to get a visa to come to Canada if you're from anything other than a highly developed first world country. It's actually much easier to go to the United States. The reason Roxham Road existed is because people could get on a plane and fly to JFK Airport in New York and then get on a bus and come to Canada. For example, people from Nigeria were doing this, and they couldn't have flown to Canada because Canada wouldn't have given them a visa, but the United States would. So Canada had all these subtle measures. We need to have various subtle measures. At the same time, a certain number of people who are temporary residents in Canada will be chosen year after year to become permanent residents because they have skills, they already have a job, they already have an education. It makes sense. We were going to take in a certain number of people, 400,000-ish or a bit less, as permanent residents. Boom, they're part of that quota. They fit the criteria, they're in. So it's going to have to be a mix of, yes, some of these temporary residents are going to become permanent residents, and some of these temporary residents are going to be, by various subtle ways, encouraged to leave because they don't qualify for permanent residency. It's going to have to be subtle tools. And one of the ones that I recommend in my book, and a lot of people will find it harsh, but I think it's sort of necessary, is to have a system where employers can only hire people who are legally allowed to work in Canada. And
that shouldn't be a controversial thing.
That shouldn't be a controversial thing. I really don't think that
I'm not sure it is anymore, actually.
Controversial. But I will say, for example, in the United States, you may think that exists in the United States. It doesn't. Like, the Americans have a system called E-Verify, but no employer is required to use it. So in theory, in the United States, employers can check the legal status of every potential employee for their company. But the law doesn't oblige them to use it because Democrats and Republicans have historically both agreed they don't want that to happen. One, because they're being lobbied by progressives on one side, and the other because they're being lobbied by big business on the other side. And so the US essentially encouraged a labor market of people who are not legally allowed to work in the United States to continue working in the United States, or to come to the United States to work, which is not a good way to run things. Like, you want people to feel that your immigration system is legal and it's functioning. And if you really need to bring in more people, do it legally, not illegally. Find smart ways, above board ways that create confidence among voters that, hey, the government's running things well, they're running things for my benefit. The Americans kind of did the opposite, and they've ended up with 40 years of chaos and conflict and controversy. We avoided that because we had a sensible, sane bureaucracy that was about being both pro-immigration and anti-irregular, illegal, and unusual immigration. Mm-hmm. We got to get back to that.
Yeah. I always caution against bipartisanship because very often it's just both parties conspiring to screw the common people together. Immigration.
But I gotta say, sometimes it's the opposite. It's because it's actually, both parties sort of look at what the average person wants, and they're like, hey, you know what? We can run it that way. So I really think that the Canadian immigration system pre-2015 was not controversial.
No, you're right.
And polls said that very few Canadians were upset about immigration because it actually was working for Canada and for the average person. And therefore, Canadians weren't upset. And the reason Canadians are now upset about immigration is not because, as I say in my book, it's not because the entire country caught airborne xenophobia as some kind of disease. It's because circumstances changed. And so Canadians said, hang on a second, I was happy with the old system, but I'm not happy with the new system. And I wish you would make things more like they were before.
So let me leave with a final question on this, which is both, I think, retrospective and forward-looking. Immigration polarization is a new thing to at least modern Canada as we've known it today. From my lifetime, it's never been a major thing. It's been limited largely to cranks, who maybe in retrospect, I feel a little bad for shaming, but it was really cranks on the fringes. Yep. But it's now front and center, major issue. We've joined the conversation with the United States and with Europe. There are different circumstances. Europe also being nation states. They're different than more civic constitutional creations like Canada and the United States with civic nationalism. So they're not exactly apples to apples. But they both Europe and the United States have been having the conversation for a long time in different forms. We're new to the conversation, at least in modern Canada. How do you think the immigration debate in Canada and in Europe and the United States is impacting Canada? And then in reverse, has Canada and our more recent experience with largely uncontrolled mass migration, are we impacting the debate in those places?
So I think Canada in the past did impact the debate in the United States, a little bit in Europe, but especially in the United States, where Americans, particularly liberal Americans, would look at Canada and say, what's going on in Canada? How come Canada isn't having these immigration controversies? How come immigration isn't tearing up American politics the way it is Canadian politics? But I think they tended to not understand the reason why. The reason Canada looked super liberal to liberal Americans on immigration is because super liberal on immigration Canada was also very conservative. It was both at the same time. Canada said, we're going to have higher immigration than the United States. We're also going to have way more border control and a sense of control over immigration than the United States. Immigration will not be perceived by Canadians as an imposition. It will be perceived by Canadians as a choice. So I think that's the historical thing that Canada got right. And that's what made Canadian immigration politics so different from American immigration politics. And I think to avoid ending up in the place where American immigration politics is now, we have to get back to that. And that to me is that's the left-right coming together. That's the yin yang that a lot of people did not understand about the Canadian system. It was so baked in that the Liberals couldn't understand that if you want to be pro-immigration, you better be pro-border control. You better be pro-limits. And if you're pro-limits, then you can actually afford to be pro-immigration because people will understand why you're doing it. Where the US system, things kind of fell apart. I mean, particularly under the Biden administration was the last straw, where a whole lot of voters said Biden doesn't seem to know what to do about these exceptionally large numbers of people coming across the Mexican border. And so like, he doesn't seem to have a plan to sort of handle this in a way that's going to be acceptable to Americans. And he didn't have a plan because the left essentially said, you're not allowed to have a plan. And that is a major contributor to reelecting Donald Trump. It may be the most important contributor to reelecting Donald Trump. So I want Canada to end up in a different place. But I think we have to learn the lessons of our own immigration history, and we have to understand how our immigration history has been better and smarter than recent U.S. immigration history, and was better and smarter until a number of years ago. And that's really the point of my book.
All right. Well, Tony, Gary, I greatly appreciate your time. I think I'm with you on a lot of it. Maybe not everything, but I'd say I'm on with you with more than even many of our own columnists on any given controversial topic. I think it's a very insightful work that you've done. I'm going to make sure I read the full thing in detail. I feel a little guilty not doing it before here, but I think I had taken enough in that we were able to have a really great conversation. So thank you for the work you've done here and sharing your time with us today.
Thank you very much for having me on. And, people don't always have to agree about everything. It's good to be able to have conversations with people you don't agree with 100%, because nobody should agree with everybody 100%. We should still be able to be civil and have conversations and listen to one another's perspectives, even if we don't 100% agree.
Yeah. Well, amen to that. Thank you very much for joining us, and best of luck with your next project.
Okay. Thanks, Derek. Great to talk to you.
All right. Cheers. That was Tony Keller, Globe and Mail columnist and author of Borderline Chaos: How Canada Got Immigration Right and Then Wrong. Thank you for joining us today, and God bless.